I need a minute of your time. Good evening, fellow Jeepers, it's me, and welcome to perhaps the first ever comprehensive video guide on how to swap a manual transmission into a 1997 to 2001 Jeep Cherokee.
Now, when I say 9701, I mean these years are unfortunately the most difficult to swap. That means if you have an older Cherokee, regardless of engine, know that most of the information presented here will apply to 1984 through 96 models as well, but you'll generally have to worry about less or different things. Of the OBD2 years, 97 through 99 are a little different than 2000 through 01, with 2000 plus being a tad more challenging than all prior years. Thankfully though, I happen to be the proud owner of this beautiful 2001 right here, so I'm going all in. Much of this knowledge can be extended to Grand Cherokee ZJs and Wrangler TJs up to 2004. Firstly though, before you commit to anything, the AW4 is a good transmission. They are stronger than the available manuals, are able to tow up to 5,000 pounds, and there are literally millions of them around as they were used for almost 2 decades in millions of vehicles. They are incredibly reliable and often last well over 250,000 miles, which alone is a very impressive claim, especially for an automatic. People often swap AW4s into vehicles that don't have them, such as the later ZJs and WJs, and sometimes even YJ and TJ Wrangler guys will equip one. It can handle the power of a given V8 engine and is often the go-to transmission for a stroker build. However, their weakness is overheating. The AW4 is known to run hotter than it should, causing the fluid inside to deteriorate, which quickly wears out clutches. Installing a transmission cooler is a great way to alleviate this problem and is much easier than manual swapping your Jeep. All I'm saying is, consider keeping the AW4, but if you're really attached to your XJ and just can't stand not shifting your own gears, a manual swap is quite possible. Among other things, manuals in older cars like this are unrivaled for fuel efficiency. You'll notice an impressive amount of usable torque, and if you know what you're doing, a faster 0 to 60 time as well. Being a slush box, the AW4 shares a few traits with my ex, like their inability to make decisions, and just like her, there's an unavoidable 26% parasitic power loss when interacting with it. You heard correctly, the fluid coupling of the torque converter means that an automatic four-wheel drive Cherokee only actually gets 74% of the engine's power to the wheels, with real-world dyno results presenting a more accurate 70% wheel horsepower. That means with an automatic Cherokee, assuming everything is operating at peak efficiency, at absolute best, you're only getting 3/4 of the engine's power. That is unacceptable. So let's do something about it. Here's how this series is going to work. In this video, I'm going to tell you everything you need and why you need it. I'm going to explain all the ins and outs of each component in detail so we don't waste any time doing that in the action phase. In the action video, I'm going to show you how to install the transmission itself, along with the clutch, flywheel, shift mechanisms, transfer case, four-wheel drive, linkage, drive shafts, clutch pedal, hydraulics, interior cosmetics, engine control module, and the wiring for the reverse lights and cruise control. For reference's sake, I'm using parts I gathered from a 1997 factory manual XJ, and I will be putting it all in my 2001 factory automatic XJ. I do have a video tearing down the 97 if you happen across one and need some parts, but for now, start writing stuff down because you've got quite the shopping list. Firstly, and most importantly, you need an AX-15 or NV3550 manual transmission assembly, either in 2-wheel drive or 4-wheel drive, whatever driveline you have. If you decide to go with the AX-15, you'll need one from 1994 to 1999. Prior to 94, these transmissions used an internal slave cylinder and have different spline counts on the output shaft, which throws a wrench in transfer case compatibility. Ideally, find one from an XJ, but know that YJ and TJ transmissions can work with minor modification. I'll explain that more when we get to the transfer case section. If you choose the NV3550, you'll need one from a 2000 through 2001 XJ or a 2000 through 04 TJ. I'm not going to debate which transmission is better, just know that they both mount up almost identically, function the same, and can be used in any year XJ with the 4.0. Once again, if you use a TJ transmission, you will need to slightly modify it, but they do work. A small thing to note between these two transmission options is the NV is about 1/5 of an inch longer than the AX. Now that might not seem like any sort of difference, but that does mess with the transmission mount, which I'll get to later. Another difference is the shift levers, so you need a lever from whatever transmission you have. The Wrangler shift levers are a lot longer than the XJ ones. They do work, but note they position the gear lever in front of the radio instead of the climate controls. Some people actually prefer that though. You will need an applicable bell housing, but it'll probably already come with whatever transmission you're using. All 4.0s share the same transmission bolt pattern, so using an AX-15 or NV3550, you won't need any adapters. If you have a pre-1994 AX-15, you can switch it to an external slave cylinder by using a 94 plus bell housing, but when we go that far back in years, I can't guarantee input shaft size or spline counts will match, so tread cautiously. The inspection plate cover, also called the clutch adapter plate for some reason, is just a thin sheet of metal that prevents debris from getting inside the bell housing. You'll have to source this from a manual XJ or TJ, as the AW4's cover doesn't fit and cannot be modified to. You're going to need a flywheel and the bolts that mount it to the engine. You can't use the flex plate or its bolts. Fortunately, the flywheel is the same between 91 to 01, so with either transmission option, you'll use the same flywheel, clutch kit, and all related components. Now, the factory service manual advises against resurfacing a used flywheel because it's apparently contoured in a unique way that helps smooth out the clutch engaging. However, I kept the flywheel off the lettuce Jeep and had it resurfaced at a local machine shop for $30, which I figured was a good deal compared to buying a new one when this one was in really decent shape. This was before I knew you're not supposed to resurface these flywheels, so I'm going to put this one in anyway, and I'll let you know if I run into any problems. A clutch kit refers to the clutch disc itself, the pressure plate, the release bearing, and pilot bearing. You need all of these things and a bit more. You obviously need the shift mechanisms for the clutch, like the fork and its return spring, and importantly, there's a sleeve that fits around the pilot bearing that I like to call the pilot bearing donut. You need this too. Lastly, for the clutch, you need the master and slave cylinder, which I have ordered from Rock Auto as a pre-bled system ready to get bolted on. I wouldn't install used parts here. Hard to find, you'll need the transmission mount adapter for a manual. Now, this thing also doubles as the exhaust hanger and is different for AX-15s and NV3550s. So the AX-15 adapter was used for 97 through 99 XJs, and the NV3550 adapter was used for 2000 through 01 XJs, which have a different exhaust system than all prior years. Whether you have California emissions or not, if you have a 2000 plus XJ, the exhaust mount above the Crossmember is different than the 99 and earlier models. What that means is if you use an AX-15 mount adapter in a 2000 plus XJ, the exhaust hanger won't line up. The good news is the exhaust hanger can simply be re-welded into a different position, which can be done yourself if you know how to weld, or done at an exhaust shop for about $100. So you can use either mount adapter with either transmission, but chances are you'll never find a 2000 plus XJ NV3550 mount adapter. So even if you're swapping in NV3550 into any year 9701, you're going to run into the same problem by using the AX-15's mount adapter, which is this. Because the AX-15 is 0.2 inches shorter than the NV3550, it has a 0.2 inches longer mount adapter. So if you use the longer 3550 with the longer mount adapter, this pushes the crossmember backwards just enough so the bolt holes don't line up. So to alleviate this, all you need to do is shave off the transmission mount stud holes in the crossmember by 0.2 inches and everything works. But if you're using an AX-15 with an AX-15 mount adapter in any year, everything just bolts up with no problems. I should also mention that yes, despite how hard it is to find one of these, you do need it, because either manual transmission is a good length shorter than the AW4. You can see the AW4 doesn't need this bracket because the mount attaches directly to the transmission, but the shorter case length of the manuals means they need this extension to attach to the crossmember. Speaking of the crossmember, you do optionally need a manual crossmember as well. I say optionally because the only difference between an automatic and a manual crossmember is how far they drop down. The automatic's crossmember is 3/4 of an inch higher than the manual's, so that means if you can't find a manual crossmember, all you need to do is add 3/4 inch spacers to the automatic crossmember to drop it down to the correct level. You'll need to extract the studs from the frame to do this, and I'm sure there's videos out there about a transfer case drop kit, which is what you'd be doing. But if you thought the crossmember was going to be that easy, you're wrong, because as is patterned by this point, the crossmember changed in 2000. I know, but it's not that bad. The transmission mount for 1987 through 99 XJs is offset, meaning the studs are off to one side. This means the holes in the crossmember are also off to one side to compensate for this. In 2000 and 2001 XJs, the transmission mount uses centered studs, and the crossmember has centered holes. So in my case, I'm going to be using a 1997 manual crossmember in my 2001 automatic XJ. All that means is I need to use a different transmission mount that has the offset studs, and I'm good to go. If you have a two-wheel drive Cherokee, completely disregard the transfer case section because they obviously don't have any of that. So the transfer cases are mostly the same between transmissions, and generally they all do work with each other, but each transmission has a different length output shaft, and because of that, the transfer case will have a different length input shaft. There are three lengths to worry about: long, medium, and short. The AW4 uses a medium length output shaft, so a transfer case factory mated to an AW4 will have a medium length input shaft. The AX-15 uses a long output shaft, so a transfer case factory mated to an AX-15 will have a short input shaft. The NV3550 uses a short output shaft, so a transfer case factory mated to an NV3550 will have a long input shaft. They are thankfully somewhat interchangeable. For example, most of you are probably using an AX-15. If so, you can 100% use the Automatic's medium length input shaft transfer case with the longer output shaft of the AX-15. It's actually probably better to do this because the splines have more area where they're actually in contact with each other, meaning that connection is technically stronger. For those of you installing an NV3550, you can use an automatic mated transfer case, but you'd be losing spline engagement. So if you off-road to any degree, I would recommend tearing apart the transfer case and installing a long input shaft, which is actually a lot easier than it sounds, just something extra to worry about. Other than the input shaft length differences, all NP231s share the same 6-stud mounting pattern, so you're good to go, except if you've chosen a transmission from a Wrangler. The Wranglers set the transfer case at a higher angle than the XJs for better ground clearance. That angle is called the clocking angle, and it's determined by the transmission. The holes that the transfer case studs mount through are drilled in a slightly different location on the transmission output flange, depending on what vehicle it came out of. This means if you have a transmission from a Wrangler, you need to re-drill the mounting holes at a 12-degree offset to the left to rotate the transfer case downward slightly to avoid it hitting the floor pan. Or I guess you could just attack the floor pan with a sledgehammer if you want. But a certain legend I know invented what we call the SAP Industries Jeep Cherokee Multi-Application Center Pivot Output Shaft Mounted 12-degree Counter-Rotation Computer-Rendered 3D Printed Universal 6-Stud Transfer Case Clocking Angle Establishment Offset Drill Bit Stabilization Device, which is a 3D printed tool that pivots around the output shaft and aligns your drill bit to the exact 12-degree angle. Bryant SAP is your man. You can contact him via link in the description, and he can set you up with your own SAP Industries Jeep Cherokee Multi-Application Center Pivot Output Shaft Mounted 12-degree Counter-Rotation Computer-Rendered 3D Printed Universal 6-Stud Transfer Case Clocking Angle Establishment Offset Drill Bit Stabilization Device for sure. Now, this thing is incredibly convenient for adapting YJ or TJ transmissions into XJs. It can of course be done without one, but I personally wouldn't try to. So if you're using a Wrangler transmission, the device is where it's at. Everything I've said so far about transfer cases of course applies to the NP231, but some of you might wonder if it's possible to use an NP242 with a 5-speed. For those unfamiliar, the 242 was never factory mated to a manual transmission, and that's because of its internal differential not necessarily cooperating with the way a manual works. So basically, the differential gears of a full-time four-wheel drive system can free spin without positive pressure on them. The reason this transfer case was only available with automatics is because of the torque converter. The transmission always has forward torque from the engine, even when coasting, even when idling, and so the only time that positive pressure is either cut off or changes direction is when the vehicle is put in park or reverse. If you have an NP242, you might have noticed this without actually noticing it. A small click in the transfer case whenever the transmission changes directions is just the gears inside having torque reapplied. This becomes much more prevalent with a manual because when you push in the clutch, power from the engine is completely disengaged, so the center differential gears can backlash, which means every time you push the clutch in, you'll hear that click, even in two-wheel drive. The good news though is that click doesn't hurt anything, it's just something you'll have to get used to. Obviously, if you're using the superior NP231 like you should, there is none of this backlash stuff to worry about because of its straight-through connection to the wheels. So in short, you absolutely can use an NP242 with an AX-15, but I'm not sure about mounting it to an NV3550 because finding a long input shaft for a 242 may prove difficult. If you found a manual with a transfer case already attached to it, that's probably the easiest route to go because then you don't have to worry about input shafts at all. I will at some point in the future make a video reviewing how the full-time mode works with a manual, and if it turns out to be causing any problems, I still have the NP231 on standby just in case. The four-wheel drive shift linkage is different between automatic and manual XJs and between NP231s and NP242s. But I'm not even going to show you how to put a stock linkage back in or how it works because the best solution to this problem is an ASSI linkage. For example, I'm going to be using an NP242 with my AX-15, but there was never a factory AX-15 NP242 combo, and therefore there was never a factory four-wheel drive linkage for that exact application. The solution? ASSI linkage. The same part will work with any combination of transfer case or transmission. Not only that, but it is incomparably better than the stock linkage anyway, so there's no better time to put one of these in. I'm not sponsored by ASSI's. I'm being genuinely serious when I say get one of these. Even if you're not manual swapping your Jeep, get rid of the stock linkage. You will never look back. Moving on to drive shafts, you might recall that manuals are significantly shorter than automatic transmissions. This moves the transfer case forward, which means you'll need a shorter front drive shaft and a longer rear drive shaft. It may be pretty difficult to track down factory manual drive shafts, but you can have custom ones built for your application. As of making this video, Rock Auto actually sells factory manual drive shafts, but you probably won't like the price they ask for a stick of metal. What I'm about to say next is equivalent to dumping a 20-gallon container of Lego bricks all over your floor. That being, drive shaft length is not only determined by transmission type, but also what rear axle you have, what front axle you have, how much lift you're on, and whether the Jeep is two-wheel drive or four-wheel drive. There is an impressive amount of different drive shafts for the XJ. The Dana 35 uses a longer rear shaft than the Chrysler 8 1/4. The high pinion Dana 30 has a shorter front drive shaft than the low pinion Dana 30. Two-wheel drives are not at all compatible with anything four-wheel drive, and NP242s actually have a slightly different rear drive shaft than NP231s. But at the end of the day, some of these differences are subtle enough to be interchangeable. For example, I'm going to use this 97 manual high pinion front drive shaft, despite my Jeep having a low pinion front axle, because it's seriously only like half an inch of a difference, which is negated by the slip yoke anyway. For the rear shaft, the Lettuce Jeep had a Dana 35 and my Jeep has a Chrysler 8 1/4. The difference in the pinion positioning means this drive shaft is just like 1 inch too long. Look, really close, but not going to cut it. This drive shaft will probably fit, maybe, but it'll be so close that literally any suspension flex is going to make the slip yoke bottom out on the output shaft, and we do not want that. So I blew $400 on a new one from Dorman, specifically part 976227. Bryant noted that was probably a dumb idea because a single cardan shaft from Adam's drive shaft would be much cheaper, but it was kind of an impulse decision because I got too excited. The transmission tunnel cover is a small sheet of metal with a hole in it for the shift lever to pass from the transmission to the interior. This part is different on automatics because they instead have a shift cable. The lever itself doesn't pass through the top of the transmission. You do need this specific manual cover plate. The automatics can't be modified to work, and this is unfortunately a 9701 specific part. However, 9702 TJs can be of some assistance. Because XJ tunnel covers and shift boots can be really hard to find, using a TJ tunnel cover and its lower shift boot is a valid alternative. The tunnel cover will bolt on, but the mounting points for the center console don't line up, meaning unless you cut and weld those tabs into the correct spot, the center console can't attach on the front. You do need the lower shift boot, which bolts to this cover. This piece of rubber acts as both a way to reduce road noise from under the vehicle and prevent interior dirt and debris from getting into the transmission. If you use a TJ cover, you use a TJ shift boot, whereas if you have an XJ cover, you need an XJ shift boot. Now, as you can see, the shift boot from the Lettuce Jeep is torn and completely unusable, and nobody makes new XJ lower shift boots anymore. Or at least that's what everyone thought until I found this one on the dark web, so I'm good to go. The clutch pedal is of course a necessity, and is arguably the single hardest piece to get a hold of. It and the brake pedal are part of the same assembly, and the manual's brake pedal is different, so you need this whole thing. Unfortunately though, it will mount up and fit properly so long as you got a 9701 one. The interchange years for these are on screen, and given the chance of actually tracking down a 97 plus pedal assembly is pretty low, and when you do find them, they sell for literally more than their weight in solid silver. Rest easy knowing you can use TJ pedals, which are a lot more common and cheaper because of it, but do need to be modified. Luckily, once again, Bryant Sap is coming in clutch.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
With a brief presentation on what he did to make TJ pedals work in his manual swap, as usual linked in the description. The engine control unit, often shortened ECU, is just a computer that tells the engine how to run based on the readings of all the sensors. The ECU is programmed differently for automatic and manual XJs, and although you can totally technically get away with not swapping it, you do need it for factory functionality and to pass emissions inspections. There's basically three options here. Option 1, keep the automatic ECU. The computers can't be hacked, but they can be tricked, and with clever manipulation of the neutral safety switch, you can have a running and driving manual Jeep with an automatic computer, but it will always think you're in neutral, meaning your reverse lights and cruise control will never work, and there are reports of the engine forgetting how to idle correctly after being driven under load in neutral for extended periods of time. It will backfire and even sometimes stall on deceleration, and on top of that, your check engine light will never go away because it's going to wonder where the hell its transmission went. And the upshift light won't work, which was an immediate no from me. Option 2, install a used ECU from a donor manual XJ. If you can find a used ECU from a manual XJ of your year, there's still not necessarily a guarantee it would work. For example, this 1997 computer might totally work on another 97 out there, but the ECUs are programmed based on VIN numbers, so using one from a different Jeep will mean the encoded VIN won't match the vehicles. So if you live somewhere that requires emissions testing, that's a big red flag for them. But aside from that, generally speaking, a used ECU will probably work in most cases. Option 3, buy a custom programmed ECU. A Florida-based company called Wrangler Fix came out of left field with the greatest news I've ever heard. You can send them your ECU and tell them what you're doing, and they can just reprogram it to run with a manual. These guys are awesome. They know these things in and out, and after trying multiple other companies, Wrangler Fix did the impossible and actually reprogrammed my ECU. I have a link to their website on which you call them and explain you're changing your automatic to a manual, and then you send them your ECU with your contact information, and in a very short time frame, they'll have it back to you, ready to go. I can't thank these guys enough. They tied this whole operation together, and I'll never forget it. The ECU is probably the single most difficult thing to source when doing the swap, and Wrangler Fix fixed that. To anyone out there who's already done the manual swap, I'm willing to bet the last piece of the puzzle was the ECU. So many have I seen who've either given up or regret doing it because of the ECU, but your Jeep's day of redemption is near because Mark from Wrangler Fix is literally a divine being with these computers. So head to the website, check them out, call their number, and let them know you're swapping a manual transmission into your automatic Jeep. And then package your ECU with a short confirmation letter including a return address and contact information. In 1 week, I had my computer back, which was just as soon as I finished the manual swap with recording everything. So once again, all hail Wrangler Fix. May the manual swap live on. But we're not done yet. Next up, gear ratios. Manual XJs came from the factory with a 3.07 to 1 axle ratio. The automatic XJs are geared at a steeper 3.55 to 1 ratio to make up for the power loss of the torque converter. This means if you're putting a manual transmission into an automatic geared Jeep, your axle ratio is going to be 355 to 1. This throws off the speedometer. Generally, people seem to like the 355 gears with a manual because you have a very noticeable amount more torque, the overdrive ratio is damn near identical, and re-gearing the axles backwards requires a lot of extra patience, effort, money, and devotion, which, thanks to my ex, are 4 things I am significantly lacking in. The easy solution is to just use the automatic speed sensor on your newly manually equipped Jeep. These sensors, or I should say the gear on these sensors, is axle ratio specific. So by keeping the sensor from the automatic, you'll have an accurate speedometer. In my application, I'm going to use the same transfer case, so I don't even need to unplug this. As mentioned toward the beginning, you are going to need the gear lever, and with that, the knob, shift boot, and bezel that pops into the center console. The gear lever itself should of course come with the transmission. A shift knob is a pretty universal thing you can source anywhere, but the shift boot is going to be much harder to find. There are a lot of options out there. I've heard of people using some 90s Dodge truck shift boots or even YJ ones as well. The bezel is a unique part, but the old automatic selector bezel can actually be cut up and used in its place. Once again though, this is an area Bryant Sapp has you covered in because he's also 3D printing these bezels, which is what I have right here. Some miscellaneous parts you'll want are the sensor side of the NSS connector. This can be either cut off your NSS after you remove it or sourced from a failed NSS on another Jeep. We're going to do some minor wiring mods, so we have a clutch safety switch and reverse lights, which I'll cover in the next video when I'm actually doing the swap. You're going to need some extra wire and the knowledge of how to solder or crimp them, but even an inexperienced electrician can accomplish these wiring tasks because we won't be doing anything too essential that'll blow up your engine in case of failure. You will of course need gear oil for whatever transmission you're putting in. The AX-15 requests 75W90 GL4, and the NV3550 needs very specifically Synchromax MS9224. The transfer cases use Dexron 3 or equivalent. Finally, after all is said, it must be done. You're going to need time, energy, the parts, and determination to make this happen. This is a pretty one-way swap. Once you do this, there will be no turning back. It is therefore your sworn duty to drive your XJ to the ends of the earth and back, despite anything Wisconsin throws at you. So, with a bottle of Mountain Dew and a fistful of ambition, let's do this.